was about to turn fall, Labor Day in 1994. And my husband Haywood and I, who lived in New Rochelle at the time, were driving around Yonkers. And he said, let's just go see this person, this Zen person that Charlie Halpin told us you should find. And Charlie Halpin, my husband at the time, was the dean of CUNY Law School, and Charlie was a good friend and had become a Buddhist and was the first dean. And he said to me, he knew I was searching. He knew I was searching spiritually. And he said, oh, you have to go meet this person, Bernie Glassman, over in Yonkers. I think this is where you're supposed to be. So my husband just said, oh, well, let's go see him. I said, but it's Labor Day afternoon. He said, oh, it's okay. We'll just knock on the door and see what he's doing. So we drove up, and I more timidly, but we walked up and knocked, and there was Roshi Bernie. And he said, oh, come in. And then he shouted up the stairs, Jishu, come down. We have guests. And that was the first time looking up, I could see Jishu walking down the stairs with a smile and greeting me. And it opened the door to an experience, a change that continues to this day. I started going to Ashburton for service. It was still very formal at the time, though it was the transition. And I was kind of very intimidated, not knowing what to do. In fact, I never knew why everyone went upstairs and came down. Turns out the bathroom was upstairs, but it took me months to ask someone why people were going upstairs. I was quite relieved to find out what it was. Anyway, then I got very nervous that I would go and sit with talk with Jishu, that I would have a session with her. And I thought I have to think of something brilliant to ask her. All what we learn, right? How to be ourselves. And I went in silence, and I remember sitting on a pillow and saying to her, can you tell me why Buddhist monks in Vietnam are self-immolating themselves? Me having been very much a part of the Black liberation movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And that was what I thought I should ask her. Actually, she had a wonderful answer about how you couldn't, because I thought this was an act of violence or self-violence. And she talked about you can't transpose cultures, which is very, very profound and true, and a kind of a lesson I learned all of my life in the work that I do to this day. And that was really, I think, the time of this period of where Jishu became my teacher. And she had a way of pushing me to learn, and also seeing me with acceptance. And I think it is a wonderful balance, those of us who are teachers, and how hard to do that, where we have a profound knowledge of something, and we're also opening the door for it to unfold in someone else. Being there, but also letting that come in. And that combination was really what an honor that she could make all of us feel so whole and human, quite okay being very human, just as we are. And I think that essence of her really allowed me and many of us to grow and blossom, and especially under her smile. When my husband Haywood was killed in South Africa, April 3rd, almost on the anniversary in 1996, working on the new constitution with President Mandela, killed in a car accident. I just talked to him, and then I got a call that he was dying. I somehow, in that frenzied, unbelievable night, told someone, find Jishu, find Bernie. And the next morning, after a night of 50 people in our living room and no sleep, there was a knock on the door, and there was Jishu. And we went upstairs, and we sat in the little corner where I sat, and she held me, and she came every morning for weeks just to be with me, just to have me in some way ask her from very mundane questions is his spirit still in his body? Because I had to prepare his body when he came back. And then Roshi Burney spoke at his very large funeral at Calvin Butts Baptist Church in Harlem. She just was there for me, just that circle of love and warmth. What a gift, what a generous gift to just say, you're not alone walking through this. You're not alone walking through this. And I really feel, in looking back, that finding her and finding Roshi Burney was in preparation for both Haywood and me to go through his death. Both of us to walk through together in the way that we have been able to do. Sewing my rakusu, which I have on, and studying with Jishu. Really a wonderful experience, because she really dug deep with us into why we were doing this and brought kind of a joy into doing it. Yes, learning to sew. I actually was a sewer, just like Jishu, so we would sew together. But coming to our house, the people that did this together, and dyeing everything in my little washing machine. From then on, all of my kids' clothes came out with this indigo blue dye for months and months, and putting together this rakusu that was actually made of African cloth that I had sewn into bedspreads for the birthing center in the South Bronx that I built, and pieces from my children's clothing, and lace from a covering that came with Haywood's body when he was sent home from South Africa. All this put together, and then June 3rd, taking Jakai and being given my Buddhist name from Jishu. Jisen Angyo is my name. What a journey of intensity with her, and also such a special time to embrace. Always learning and always growing under this watchful eye that felt like we were in a circle. There were lots of activities and community being built in Yonkers at that time, very free, breaking out, as both Ken and Mudra have expressed. And one of it was that we had a women's group. And it was in that women's group that I really saw Jishu trying to balance the many, many different responsibilities she had as a teacher, as a leader, as a partner to Roshi Burney, as a woman trying to find her balance and happiness. Very complicated. And we were never friends because she was my teacher, and yet we were sisters, walking through this undefined space together, and trying to just be there as I could see what she was going through. And then, as you both said, her stroke, her realization of the seriousness of her heart condition, her acceptance, her determination to fight back, and a sense of optimism as she drove off to New Mexico. She really, I remember hearing of her joy those first couple of days, only a couple of days in her new home, looking out at the majesty of the mountains and the incredible vastness of the desert. And I think she found a peace. She found a peace all encircling her. Remember the call telling me of her death, the ensuing grieving for our losses, as well as gratitude for her enormous contributions in being my teacher. And just in reflection, Jishu really combined a keen intellect with a large heart of compassion. People often saw Roshi Burney as the intellect of Zen. Jishu knew she was brilliant, really a fine, fine mind. And she had that heart at the time I met her to really open, to put it all together. She really had a way of breaking everything down to those of us who were her students, making meaning in our hearts and minds, and smiling, always smiling, especially when my face suddenly reflected some new understanding. Khalil Gibran in The Prophet, when asked to speak on teaching, said, "The teacher who walks in the shadow of the temple among her followers gives not of her wisdom, but rather of her faith and her lovingness. If she is indeed wise, she does not bid you enter the house of her own wisdom, but rather leads you to the threshold of your own mind. And even as each one of you stands alone in Buddha's knowledge, so much each one of you be alone in your knowledge of the way and in your understanding of the truth. I think that's Jishu's gift as a teacher. So I say thank you, Jishu, for being my teacher and walking on this path. Jishu sits with me every day on my altar. So every day I see her smile, and whatever I'm trying to remember my breath and come back to the quietness and the aliveness of the sitting practice, Jishu's still my teacher and always will be.
You know, Jishu is my heart teacher. I cried more with her than I had cried with anybody else in my life, including my analyst, who I was with for 7 years. And yet I think I only worked with her for 5 years. And for a chunk of that, she was recovering from the stroke that she had somewhere in, I don't know, the 3rd year maybe of my relationship with her, something like that. I mean, she was, you and she were the senior, you were the Dharma holders at CCNY when I arrived, and I think you were both teaching Ox classes. I ended up in her Ox class. Jennifer was in that class. I don't remember anybody else who was in that class. I remember Jennifer, I remember being paired with you for that exercise that we did on where we would take turns asking each other over and over again, who are you? And I've thought of, you know, it's like it could have been yesterday. I think I did 3 of the Ox class sequences with Jishu on the skandhas, on the precepts, and on the paramitas. And she was wonderfully open. She gave us the assignment I think in the paramita class of taking something that we did mindlessly and working on doing it mindfully. And she was going to do this along with us. And her mindless practice was brushing her teeth. And she told a story that I still laugh about. You know, it's like she would find herself in the kitchen washing the dishes and talking on the phone at the same time, and her toothbrush was still in her mouth. And that was mindlessly brushing your teeth. I had this, you know, kind of rare privilege with her. Bernie was very ambitious for her. Mujo mentioned that, and one of his plans was for her to become the abbot of ZCNY. In order to become abbot, she needed to supervise her first shuso through the kind of shuso training period, the 3-month training. And Jishu had a number of kind of senior students, but none of them were ordained, and that didn't cut it for Soto. So in order for her to become an abbot, in the Japanese Soto world, she needed to supervise a priest through the Shuso period. And out of some sort of, I guess, gratitude to Bernie, I volunteered to ordain and be, Jishu's first Shuso, which meant studying with her very closely. And I did also get to see some of how hard it was for her, being both student and wife. In the privacy of their home, she did call Bernie Sensei Honey, which I loved. Wasn't quite calling him honey, but was better than calling him sensei. But I could see how hard it was for her to feel confident in herself, because she always seemed to have there's always this doubt. Had Bernie made her a teacher because she was a teacher or because he was in love with her? And I think I saw that as a source of doubt. But it played on what I saw as her humility. She was the most humble person I had ever met. Some people thought she was insecure. Now I wonder, like, how do you tell humility from insecurity? And I'm not sure. But she was living with this and working with this very powerful guy, and it was hard. And he would give her tasks, as he would everybody, and then within days take them back and do them himself, because he didn't really trust anybody else to do it as well as he could do it. She was at our house for the Shuso entering ceremony. She stayed overnight, and I drove her to the airport. She was flying out west to meet Bernie, and she was upset. They were trying to decide whether to move to Santa Fe or Santa Barbara, and she really wanted to go to Santa Fe. That's where she felt more comfortable, and she was sure that despite her preferences in this thing, Bernie was going to insist on Santa Barbara. When she came back, it was like a big surprise that Bernie had gotten on board on the Santa Fe plan. Watching her recover from the stroke was really pretty amazing. And I think probably inspired Bernie years later when he was working, with his own stroke. I mean, for a short period of time, Jishu was totally paralyzed. And then she came almost all the way back. I think the only thing really at the end that she couldn't do, that bothered her anyway, was that she couldn't thread a needle. She loved to sew. And she taught me to sew, which was a terrifying project. First to do the rock suit for Jukai, and then to do the kesa for Tokido. She made it wonderful. Bernie had depended on her a lot, much more than he realized. She was the softness in his life. And when he lost her, he realized he had to soften himself. He didn't have her anymore to be his softness. And Bernie needed that, especially before, in those days, because he would really piss people off. And I remember saying to Jishu, I think we were at Auschwitz, and Bernie had just humiliated me in a large room of people. Not that much of an unusual occurrence. And I was saying, I can't take this anymore. And Jishu asked me then if I had the courage to be Bernie's teacher. I love her. It's amazing to me that she meant so much to me and made such a difference in my life in such a short time.
So when I was asked to speak about Jishu at this memorial or remembrance in the month of March, which is when her birthday was, I said, sure, of course, sure. But I didn't realize that I was supposed to be speaking about her as a teacher, and I actually know very little about her as a teacher. But I knew a lot about her and a lot about her as a student. And when she came to what was then Grayston, the big house in Riverdale, where the Zen community began, she had given up everything. She was a PhD in biology and a researcher, and she came to practice Zen with Bernie. And in those days, in those early days of the Zen, what we called ZCNY, the Zen community of New York, it was modeled on the typical Zen community in this country as if it were a monastery, and which included having week-long sessions at the end of every month, and just a certain structure and so on, all of which Bernie left behind to the delight of some and the horror of others. And so Jishu was there at the very beginning, and she became a priest, and she was totally committed. And Bernie, almost said sensei, really fell for her. I mean, he was very drawn to her, and he told me it was her sincerity. But I think part of that came from the fact that she suffered more than I think anybody I've ever known in my life. And it was a huge struggle in those early days that she wanted to be free of something. And I think I would say, given the language that she began to use at the end of her life, that what she didn't have was compassion for herself. And in fact, I think didn't even know what that meant. And it meant that she became difficult to get along with in those early days for many people. Um, she was very competitive. Bernie was very drawn to her. And of course, he wanted her to have the big Kensho experience and to get deeply involved in koan study and so on and so forth. Well, it just wasn't her thing. And that started to become clear. And I think when he really did his 180-degree turn towards what he then called social action and left behind this grand building, and moved to the slums of Yonkers and started the bakery and started working with the homeless and doing the homeless retreats and so on. I think this is when Jishu was in her element. This was her thing. She was happy doing this, and I think very appreciated by many of the people in Yonkers that she worked with. She and I we both had PhDs. That doesn't mean too much to this non-credential person here, but we were the same age. And she and I and a couple of my, two of my college friends and Larry Shainberg's wife, we were all exactly the same age, born in the same year. So once a year we would meet and have dinner together and talk about what it was like turning 50 and 55 and 60. I can't. And then, Jishu died and one other person died. And I think there are two of us left now, but that was a wonderful thing because each of us had a very different life. And she, brought something completely different to this little group, this yearly group of women. And, talked about what it was like being married to her teacher. And I remember that one of the people who really helped her enormously was Pia Geiger, the Roman Catholic Swiss nun who was a Roshi, and much of her Zen training had been in Japan. An absolutely marvelous woman. But she really wanted Jishu to stop calling her husband sensei. She went after her about all of those things. And I think, and at the end of Jishu's life, I think not long before she died, Pia had her, before they moved to the Southwest, Pia had her come to Switzerland by herself. And when she died, which was, I think, a time of enormous guilt for Bernie. He had really driven her and she was drivable. She was a very hard worker and, totally there. And anybody who really worked with him or knew him in this way knew the Zen master, in charge. And so they made this long trip to Santa Fe. She lost her beloved cat on the way. It was just tough. And they finally got there, and it wasn't long after that she had her aorta burst, I think, and she was completely, from what I hear from Joan and Halifax, and I can't remember who else was there, but visiting her in the hospital, she just was cheerful. She was all there and awake. But when she died, and the funeral had taken place, which was a real classic Zen funeral, Sheila Hickson and I stayed here in New York and had a sort of memorial at Sheila's house for everybody who wasn't at that funeral in the Southwest. And And then she and I went to visit Bernie, probably a month after Jishu's death, or maybe not quite that long. And he was suffering. I mean, this was such a loss to him. It was a profound experience of loss. And he had experienced loss in his early life as well. And he asked Sheila and me to read Jishu's diary. And we did. And it was kind of a, I'm trying to think of a good word, kind of, oh, I can't think of a good word, but he had read it after she died, and he needed us to read, he needed witnesses to share with him. And, her trip to Switzerland was written about, and Pia really going after her about her dependence on Bernie. This is not about her social action work, it's not about anything except this man and this woman married and having a very unusual situation. I mean, the Zen master and the student and so on. And Pia, I think, really taught Jishu about having compassion for oneself. And it was in this diary, it was like the light bulb went off, and it was wonderful to read this. And she said she realized that that's what would enable her to have compassion for everyone else. And I think until then, there were certain people she really enjoyed and enjoyed working with and admired and so on and so forth. But she had a hard time with the old members of the Sangha. But I think that was the big change. There was something there really wonderful that happened. But I think also the move to so-called social action, I went after Bernie about that term because I said what he was really talking about would apply to the diaper changing mother of a newborn and a toddler, and to the emergency room doctor and so on and so forth. It wasn't just about working on the streets with the homeless and so on. But I think she really was in her element, and she did such marvelous work in Yonkers. And well, I was on Cape Cod when the news came of her death, and it just was such a shock to me. Not that I hadn't expected it, I knew she was sick and so on, but it was tough. And those of us who knew her well or worked with her closely will always miss her. There was just, and her, when her capacity for laughter, it wasn't always there, active, but it was huge when it was active. And she could be a lot of fun. And I realized that the humility really was fundamentally there as who she was. And it was when she finally herself started softening towards herself that's what came out. And it was beautiful. And just want to add one little thing to what I said, that I remember at the end of the transmission ceremony that Bernie did with both Enkyo and me together, and Jisha was there and Sheila was there, he had a little group of us together in the room. And I'll never forget Jishu's just when she just came over with the biggest smile and the biggest hug. And it was about having another woman. And she really, so the soft part became accepted, articulated, owned, and expressed. And it was wonderful. Yeah.
Very beautiful to hear you talk about Jishu. I of course, I almost say didn't meet Jishu and didn't know her. Of course, I've heard some stories, and some of you brought up that she really came alive in her teaching when in this transformation to the social action side of it, when that shift happened. But is it possible to say something about what was it that came alive in that aspect of the teaching more? You've given some things about her compassion and her intellect and so on, and her hard work. But what was it more that came into bloom in when the practice and the vision changed and the move to Jonkers and all of that work that many of you did there? Thank you.
Thanks, Pake. Nancy, I see you have your hand, so please go ahead.
There we go. That's an interesting question. I mean, of course, what preceded that was a monastic kind of practice. So a lot of sitting and a kind of, if you'll excuse the expression, goal of waking up. So and Zen, typically, historically has placed a great deal of emphasis on the waking up experience to be followed by actualization, namely somehow integrating it, but also to be followed by being back in this world with other human beings doing the work of the Bodhisattva. And I have a feeling that I want to associate this with women, but I think some people come to Zen practice and that's where the practice begins. It may stay there, and then it might move into some kind of realization of the so-called nature of reality, and other people it's the reverse. But I think she was practical. She was concerned about other people's suffering. And so I think that transition is part of the classical transition in the history of Zen, but she was home there, as opposed to sitting alone in the Zendo, pushing to, yeah.
Geez, there were ways in which this Grayston work was not for Jishu. And she came home one night and told Bernie she had quit. Bernie, by that time, had retreated into this, because he was the founder. Chuck Leaf was the president. But Jishu came home and said she had quit her job at Grayston. And Bernie was horrified. He wanted to undo that, go back. And she stood her ground. It was like things were very tense there. And then they went off on vacation. I think they went to Hawaii to get their dental work done. Which seems like a long way to go for dental work, but there was a Zen dentists in Hawaii, so they went to Hawaii for the dental work. Jishu having quit, Bernie trying to convince her to unquit. And they came back from that vacation, and Bernie announced that he was quitting too. And it started that year or more of unwinding their commitments and real estate and all this stuff in Yonkers. And they were going to go do peacemaking. And Bernie's first plan was that they wouldn't have a home. That they would just be kind of itinerant peacemakers, and they would travel around the world and stay for a month or two at a different peacemaker village and help the people there grow that village on whatever project they were working on. Jishu said, no, that's all good and planned, but we got to have like a home base. I got to have someplace to come back to, someplace to land. And that's when they started looking, where they were going to move, next.
I remember when at 5 Ashburton, in that little corner in Yonkers, when Bernie started, I think this is when women, Sheila and Ankyo and so on, they were starting to reduce the hierarchy to a circle. And the way the council was starting to be practiced and so on. And I remember Jishu, the leader was not supposed to say anything unless it involved sort of correcting what was happening. And I remember Jishu telling me, she said, oh God, I had to interrupt that. I said, Bernie, that's not a feeling. So we laughed about this and so on. And then after her death, it could have been 6 months later, Bernie was in New York, and I was the very last person, and this should not have been at all. To be on the board of, not sure if it was the Grayson Foundation or ZCNY, but it was people who were not in the Sangha practicing, but fancy people. And here's this pathetic little Zen student still left over on the board, and I'm getting ready to resign. So Bernie's visiting, and he's sitting there, and there are tears starting to come out of his eyes. And these fancy Madison Avenue people are sitting there not knowing what to make of this. And I'll never forget it. He said, it's okay, it's just love. And that was Jishu's influence on Bernie. That was very deep and transformational.
I remember the day that I met her. It was in the that old house in Yonkers, and Bernie, in his usual way, there was a retreat happening, I think, the whole week, and he brings Paco and me up to the apartment, and I think he mentioned something about feeding them, and I felt so uncomfortable. For me, it was, oh my God, she's the wife of Roshi, and she's going to serve me food. It just seemed like incongruous. No, you don't do that. She looked at me and gave me her little sort of wan smile, but her eyes were so sincere. She just really saw me. And she said, well, I have some frozen food here. That's basically all I have right now. And I said, whatever you pick out of the freezer is fine. I don't think we exchange very many words. I can't remember them, but I just remember that how she just with her little smile eased my discomfort. And it just seemed to me such a, giving act. She shared with me little things along the way, very simple, very short. Her discomfort every time she remembered that she worked in a lab and all those mice that she killed. It was more than a discomfort. It was a real suffering. In Auschwitz, when we stood side by side And we held each other that day because we were before the shooting wall, ready for ceremony. And we just communicated again through the eyes, and I guess through the heart. I mean, you know, what can I say? And then, of course, when they left for Santa Fe, and we had dinner together that night, and we chatted and we talked. And again, she was quiet, but participating, and she seemed to be at such ease that day. Tired, very tired. That move took a lot out of her. And as we finished and they got in their trucks again, and as the truck took off with her and the window, she was sitting by the window, and she again grabbed me, held me with her eyes, and that was the last time I saw her. But I had spent enough time there with her in the project, and for whatever reason, I was drawn to making that be something that kept her alive. And as Paco said, it was a long story. And I remember that I carried that like a, like a cross on my back. I swear, all of her samples, all of the fabric that was there, the whole story. And I would not give it up until I knew that whoever took it, because I couldn't carry it forward. Because I was working full time at the time as well. I said, I will not give this up, because quite a few people stepped up to take the project, even Grayston, but they were going to basically make it an arts and craft program willy-nilly with no direction. And I said, no, no. So I'm so happy that Daikin stepped up, and happy that it seems to be just propagating, and little Jishus all over the world, all over at least the East Coast. So those are my beautiful memories, and of my first main teacher, Jishu.
Ken, I think I was at your Tokido that 9 months after Jishu's death, and that was my Jukai class. That was my Jukai group. So I came to ZCNY in 1989 because I had this philosophy professor in college, Mujo, Nancy Baker, and she introduced me to sitting and to ZCNY. And soon after arriving, I met Jishu. I think that was around 1989. That was before she had married Sensei Bernie. Grayston Family Inn opened shortly after. I was sitting in the Zendo at 5 Ashburton with Shep, who I believe was Jishu's dog, or lived with Bernie and Jishu. Do you remember Shep? And I remember that Zendo, hours and hours and hours of sitting in that Zendo with cat poop in the corners. But it was magic. And so I love just the opportunity to have some memories of Jishu, because she's so interwoven into my early Zen life, the original Sangha. And she wasn't yet a teacher, and Mujo was yet to receive transmission. Grayston Family Inn, she worked so hard. And I remember that, just tireless, going through the process to get certified to be a early childhood center. And what that means in the city of Yonkers is an enormous task. You have to persevere and document and show the need, and the production of these grants, reams of paper. And in the midst of it all, she'd be in her robe, coming up from morning zazen and, lighting incense, and then changing clothes into Pamsula wear. And I have memories of how happy she was with Pamsula and Eugenia. and sewing and just, and one memory early in, so after college, I had the opportunity to go work for Grayston when it moved up to 21 Park Avenue. And we'd have session and then the work week. And I remember one retreat, sitting, and then these 4 or 5 large wooden crates arrived with Japanese calligraphy on them, shipping crates. They just arrived on the porch. So Bernie said, these have arrived from Japan. They're a gift for here. And somehow Bernie ended the retreat. We were no longer going to be sitting. It was a day early. And I remember just being there and just, Bernie just let us open these crates. He was just like, carefully, just go. So here we all got, you know, there were 5 of them, big Manjushri, beautiful altar pieces, large. And I remember just being filled with joy and seeing Jishu with this smile, and there was laughter, and it was the most pleasant time.
I was actually the first program director of the Maitri Day Center and Isan House. I was hired by Chuck Leaf and then met Bernie and Jishu. And Bernie was very, he trusted Chuck at that time, and he said, well, welcome. And when I met Jishu, there was just something about her. I wanted to know this woman. I wanted to know more of her, of who she was. There was something extraordinary about her in her humility, her, in a strange way, nobility as well. We talked a lot about Grayston and what it meant to her, which was very important to me in terms of informing me in the work. I was not a Buddhist. And she was fascinated with my faith tradition. And she talked to me a lot about Pamsula, and that she asked me if it was permissible for her to have a space in the, at that time, it was the nuns' chapel, a space so she could put Pamsula in and have Eugenia in there. And I said, this is your home. This is, and so anyway, we would sew together and laugh together. Like we had a little quilting bee, the 3 of us, Jishu, Eugenia, and Maria, you know, the quilting bee. And I still have a bit of Pamsula. And I never, I always wanted to be in her presence. It was, just being in her presence, I felt calmer, more assured that I was doing the right thing, more motivated. And that was just by being in her presence. And, you know, that Mitch Albom book of the 5 people you meet in heaven, you know, and some of them, you might not even remember their name, or you might not have even spent much time with them at all, but they have made such an indelible mark on your life and your journey. And for me, Jishu was one of those 5 people that I know I will meet in my heaven. And when she and Bernie moved, I was devastated. And when I heard of Jishu's death, I was very angry. And it took me a while to get over that. And the way I got over that was that I would have conversations with Jishu. And that year after her death, I went to Auschwitz. And we spoke quite a bit there. And she will always be that woman that is the embodiment for me of the divine feminine. And I remember her and I speak of her with much love. And I believe myself to have been blessed by knowing her.
First of all, I'm honored to be here with all of you to remember Jishu. And when Chuck asked me to fill in for him, so to speak, on this panel, it brought back lots of memories and of our time at Greyston with the bakery and with the Greyston Foundation, and memories of Jishu. And I actually found my Pamsula vest to wear for the occasion in honor of Jishu in her work. And apart from the having this occasion of honoring, it's always good to honor our ancestors. And she's an ancestor in this lineage. And it's also refreshing to honor the woman leader within Buddhist Sangha, which doesn't happen as much as it might. So that's also very impressive for me. And I think of Jishu, I think of many things. I think of her presence, and particularly in contrast to Bernie. Talk about an odd couple in a way. I loved seeing the interplay between a very earthy energy of Bernie Glassman Roshi, and then a very refined and elegant energy of Jishu. And I can remember many times going to this little cafe in Westchester, and Bernie would order like a bunch of Italian sausages and spaghetti and all sorts of stuff. And Jishu would have like a clear soup with a few dumplings in it. And they both are so delightful in their differences. But I also think of Jishu in particular in connection with the empowering of women and taking care of families in terms of the child care center at Greyston, and in terms of the Pamsula project. A lot of the clientele that Greyston served, it was a mix, but I think it was weighted towards the males, and Jishu made a point of finding something particularly focused on empowering local women in the community. And she joined that with the beautiful practices that go back to the early days of the Dharma, in the sewing of robes and the kind of Japanese quilting traditions, and how that has come down over the centuries. And so joining that elegance of that, her own elegance, to offer that a way of entering into that kind of quality of mind for the local women who are struggling in their various ways, to showcase their talents, their sewing talents, and to introduce a kind of an aesthetic eye vision, which is in itself is a transmission, a Dharma transmission, and very much enriching and empowering, and bringing out in people qualities they might not have noticed in their struggles. So she was could see that in people, and she could bring it out. And the other thing that comes up for me is when Jishu and Bernie were getting ready to move to Santa Fe, near the Joan Halifax's Upaya Center. And I remember it seemed to me she was like a waxing moon. Her power, she was coming into her power more and more, I felt, just observing as a teacher and as a friend, and beginning to distinguish herself individually as well as with her connection with Bernie. So she was really in an upward energy trajectory and taking on more and more responsibility in the teaching side, as well as, a project management and kind of side. So she was very excited about this, and I think felt ready for this next challenge. And so I remember her, excitement as they're getting ready to move. And it was so untimely, I would say, tragic that so soon after they arrived is when she became so ill and died. So it felt it was just, she'd done so much, but she was going to a whole different level. And then death sent its message, and that was that. And then you could tell how many lives that she touched by the funeral that was then held at Upaya Center. People from all over had a connection with her and showed up and participated in a quite beautiful ceremony at the end of her life. So I guess I think that Jishu had a kind of, she's quiet in many ways, quiet, but feisty at the same time. We say gentle but tough. And I think her influence is worthy of recognition and some gratitude for the role she played in Bernie's life and in the life and development of the Zen community, and particularly Peacemakers Orders, and in my case, primarily through our connection with Grace, both in the bakery and in a foundation in Yonkers.
I'm more than honored to be here, to remember my teacher. And I want to thank Judy, because Judy perfectly teed it up for me so the kinds of things that I want to say, almost to the point that while Judy was talking, I ran to the closet and I got my peacemaker vest. I said, oh my goodness, why can't I put my peacemaker vest? You've heard, and many of you have heard this story, and I'm going to make it very quick. I have been looking for Bernie after going through a very difficult personal situation in my life, my third divorce, and had not been able to get him. And ultimately, I did get him because I saw an announcement somewhere that he was going to be at Omega, and I went to Omega early that Friday to find them, and I couldn't find them. And then for some reason, I saw these two people walking down the hill from the cafeteria up in the second floor, and I realized that was Bernie. I don't know why, but I knew it was Bernie. It was Bernie and Eve. At which time he announced that he couldn't stay, that he had gotten it wrong, that it was the wrong date, that he had been there the weekend before, and he had got it wrong because he was committed to being in Harlem at Jennifer Dorn's husband's memorial service, which he had committed to do, and he left us there with someone else. And that's how I first met Bernie. When he did come back Saturday and they did the retreat, he and I were able to have lunch together, or breakfast or something, coffee. I asked him to have coffee with me, and he said, would you meet me on Monday at Grayston, and I'll take you to lunch. And I did that Monday, and we went to Denny's up in the Executive Manor up there, and he asked me, after much conversation, would I be interested in becoming a beginner's priest? Which I basically said to him, yes. There's a long story behind that, but I'm not going to go into that. He said, but I'm not going to be your teacher. Your teacher is going to be my wife. I will teach you on the priest side because she's not a priest at this moment. And so I had the privilege of studying with both of them. And I did get ordained as a priest, along with Joan Halifax and Chihuahua, that's old age. Somebody help me. Who was the other person that got ordained with me?
Diane Shaneberg.
Thank you, Diane Schoenberg. And so after that, Jishu and I and Bernie had a conversation, and she basically said, and this is the feisty part that Judy talks about, the quiet, feisty, and tough part, because Bernie, it always looked like Bernie got his way. And probably that was true, but there are certain times that he did not get his way. And he said, Paco has ordained as a beginner priest, but quite frankly, she said it very nicely, but I kind of knew what she meant. He really has to take Jukai. And Bernie said, well, I didn't take Jukai. Maisumi Roshi ordained me, and so she said, he's not you. He needs to take Jukai. And after a long story and a big conversation, I ended up taking Jukai, and it was one of the most wonderful things that I've ever done. Because truth be told, becoming a ZPO priest, Zen peacemaker, or the priest, I didn't have a full sense. And studying with Jishu, the precepts began to give me a foundational beginning, very light beginning of what was coming for me for the next 20 years. That was the first beginning of experiencing Jishu. When she passed away, I cried a lot, I grieved a lot, and I went into seclusion in one of my rooms in the house that I was living in. And in part was because I was troubled, because I had a trip that weekend to take all my kids to Disney World in Florida. And so I knew I had to be in Santa Fe, but I also thought about the kids. And so while I was grieving, my youngest one, Alexandra, who's now 31, at that point must have been 6, and no one dare go into that room. The only one that they would send in would be her, because she was the empress. She was born January 8th, the same day as my birthday. And so she came in, and I asked her to come in, and she came in and she sat next to me in my cushion. And she said, Daddy, 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 we all decided that if we don't go to Florida, it'll be okay. You can go to your teacher's memorial. And that took a lot of weight off my back. And I meditated on it. And I asked Jishu in my meditation, what would you do? And without a blink of an eyeball, I got this message: go to Disney with your kids. And that's what I did. So that's my stories on Jishu's, and there's a lot more, including the fact that both my business partner then and very good friend, Noemi Santana, who's now my wife, who's in this call, became her students. And so one of the things that happened, and Judy set that up, and Peter Cunningham set this up. One of the things that we were very much involved with, and there was a picture of Eugenia. Eugenia was the woman who did the sewing for Pamsula, and she was the boots on the ground, as Roshi Daikin likes to say. When Grayston could no longer sustain the program for many, many reasons, which is not important to go into, Noemi and I went and captured all the things that were left over, all the materials, all the designs and stuff like that. And we took it and we had it in storage for probably 10 years or more. And then Roshi Daikin, at some point inherited all of that. But before that happened, I decided that in my empowerment ceremonies with 3 of my successors, I would call it the Pamsula lineage. So Roshi, Joaquin Salazar, and Angel Williams and Daikin are all got their transmission ceremonies through the Pamsula lineage, because I wanted to preserve her energy and her spirit in more than just the Pamsula, whether it got going or not. In the few minutes that I got left, Jishu Daikin has set up at the Pamsula Zen Center in New York. We're now have a Monday night sitting at Union Theological Seminary. We have a feeding program also that is in that spirit, where 30,000 meals have been served every Wednesday. There's 7,000 meals that have been served at the synagogue that Salman Schechter founded, which I believe Bernie might have been either he took Salman as his spiritual leader in Judaism or his teacher in Judaism, but they were good friends. They're very, very good friends. So now something is going on there every other Sunday in relationships to Pamsula. And in addition to that, in Youngstown, Ohio, there is a Zen Center, a Pamsula Zen Center. There is a Zen Centers in a Unitarian Church in Westchester, New York. And one is possibly going to be set up in Iowa City in a couple of weeks. So we've wanted to keep her name and her spirit, and this sense that Judy talked about of the discarded parts of humanity, and her emphasis on women, and the sewing, discarded cloth, and putting together and doing beautiful, beautiful things.
So I remember I was so glad to see Peter's photos because they show Jishu laughing. So I remember it reminded me immediately of the very first time I saw her, which was the very first time I visited the Zen community of New York in Riverdale, or even Yonkers. And we happened to roll in, not into Zazen, but into a community meeting where they were talking about their plans, what they were going to do in the world of social service. And that's when I knew that this place was for me. But, people were really exhausted around Bernie because, there was nothing linear about the way he worked. He worked in some other kind of dimension. And one of the results was that we would be very tired. And that evening, I didn't know anybody. I saw him and all these other people around the table. And this is the end of the full day of work. And they're really beat. Everybody's, other than Bernie, who's always up in the clouds somewhere, everybody else is kind of tired. And except for one woman. And I remember her so well. She was to my right. She looked so young. She was wearing a skirt, unlike most, women who were wearing pants and all that. And she was so girlish. That was the word that came to me. She was really like somebody who's like, really, this is going to be great. This is going to be great. There was that kind of girlish energy about her. So I remembered that very clearly. For the next 13 years, she really took on a big burdens. But, she was really, that evening, I remember so clearly how girlish she was. What I want to say is that when we worked with Bernie and Grayston, Bernie had almost an intuitive sense of where your limits were, or where you didn't want to work, you didn't want to be engaged, you didn't want to do this, you didn't want to do that. And that's where you were guaranteed to be put in that slot. So, for example, I hated phones. I just really have a hard time with phones. And you knew that I was going to be on the phone all day taking orders for cakes for the Grayston Bakery, and other people had their issues. And that's exactly where you ended up being put in to do this work. Now, Jishu, what did he give her? He gave her to be the head bookkeeper accountant for the entire place. Now, of course, you have to remember that we never really had money. We were always running out of money. Creditors were always calling us up. I especially remember when we got into the Ben & Jerry's line for ice, for their ice cream and making bakery products for that. And companies go broke. In other words, just when they're in that trajectory, when they can start zooming up and really prospering, that's exactly when you can go broke because you're not ready for that. And so we took loans from Citibank and various people, and we had the whole story around Ben & Jerry's is a talk by itself. It's now I can laugh at it. It didn't feel like a laughing matter then. But I remember calls coming in from Citibank and this person and that person. And Bernie would say, I'm not taking this, Jishu, you take it, And she would have to be talking to them about how we didn't have the money to pay back. We don't know when we're going to have the money to pay back. We thought we had a product with Ben & Jerry, but I guess we found out later that we didn't. So we're back to scratch. And they're just telling her, close up shop, stop the whole thing, forget the whole thing. And if we had done that, there would probably be no Grayston Bakery today. And what I remember hearing from her, and she talked this out, is that she had lived a very, she had been a researcher, a biochemist, and she said, I always felt proud of paying my bills, paying my rent on time, paying my utilities on time. You know, I'm like that. And she's put in a position where none of that was happening. It was like standing in a swamp and the place is just swallowing you down and you can't do the things you're used to doing. We used to laughingly say, that's our practice. That was the practice at the Zen community of New York. And this is what she took on. And sometimes she got really upset at him and how are we running and why are we doing this and why is it like that? But basically, she would pick up that phone and talk with them and assure them, yes, they will get their money back at some point. We don't know when. And, you know, she got on the receiving end of so much stuff and anger and, you know, and she just did it. She was very clear about her life and work in Greyston. She was very clear about why she was doing that. And I'll give you another example that affected me for many, many years to this very day. So, as I said, Bernie liked to put people into positions they seemed to be highly unsuited for. And so when the Greyston Family Inn started, and that was really not just the name of the housing for homeless families, but at that point for the entire social service program, which then, you know, divided into different things. Who did he put in charge? He put Jishu in charge. And now you have to understand, she's a biochemist researcher. She has spent her life in labs, surrounded by lab equipment, very few people around her, and it's how she was comfortable. And suddenly she's put to head basically an organization that's there to meet people's needs, to talk to them, to see who they are. And by the way, people who are very different from her, very different background. You know, and she agonized over that, like that she's the wrong person, she's not suited for this, there are people way better than her for this kind of work. And this went on for quite a while. But what I remember very vividly is, you know, I used to work on, we worked on weekends, and on Saturdays I would come in to do orders for the bakery. And one Saturday, I came into my desk to do that, and there was a whole pile of newsletters. We were then publishing the Greyston newsletter and calling it The Wheel. And I had finally gotten an assistant to help me, someone who had really not held much of a job before. And I had shown her, I'd given her the full, you know, the basic original of the whole newsletter and said, please make 300 copies. We'll do it Friday. And so I come back on Saturday and there were 300 copies towering over my desk, completely with the wrong pages, the back, you know, the front and back are completely wrong. You know, so there's 300 full copies of newsletters that we can't send out. And I just felt frustrated up to here. This is what it is to work in this community. This is what it is to work with people who've never had jobs before, who can't hold on. You know, the whole refrain came up in my head from sheer tiredness and frustration. So, and there was no, and I think there must have been, there are always bakers on the floor, but in the administrative offices, the only person who was there was Jishu. She was upstairs. So I stalk upstairs with the 300 copies of these newsletters. And I walk over to her desk and I say, look at what I have to deal with. Look at this. This whole thing is going to have to be redone. It's going to take hours. We have such a lousy Xerox machine. It's going to break down 10 times in the process of redoing this. And I don't know what I'm doing here anymore. This is just way too much. So she just listened to my rant, didn't say anything. And then when I was done, she looks up at me and says, I don't know why you're here, I'm here to learn how to be with people. Those were her exact words. I'm here to learn how to be with people. You know, she wasn't there to accomplish more. She wasn't, you know, she had accomplished a lot by then. She wasn't there to achieve, to get things finished, to get things built, to become famous. Maybe she wasn't there anymore to get enlightened, though certainly, I mean, she was a very dedicated practitioner. She often said she had come to Graceton to sit, and instead of sitting, this is what she's doing, answering creditors' calls and dealing with me ranting about 300 newsletters that are all wrong. What she knew then was where her edge was. And she said, I'm here to be with people. That was it. And I turned around and left. I think yesterday I figured out that's easily 35 years ago, that exchange. But it was so powerful for me, those few clear words that reflected a reflection on what am I doing with my life? What am I doing with my practice? Why am I here? And coming up with an answer very clearly. The only thing I'd like to add to this, because Chuck isn't here, is the fight that she put up in Graceton to keep that child care center going. And it was a fight, because child care centers don't support themselves, especially ours, which started from infants. That's literally 6 weeks old. Most daycare centers would not support that because it took much more. By law, you had to have more caregivers for children that age. And we had that. And she, who didn't have her own children, I think really connected with that. She connected with the mothers, how they needed to find good childcare for their children, for their babies. And of course, the child care center was always running out of money because there's very little help for things like that. And so there were many board meetings in Graceton, which were always on the agenda was to close the child care center because we couldn't afford it. And she fought tooth and nail to keep it open. And I'm sure if Chuck was here, who served as chairman, and he served as CEO and other places, he would remember those board meetings that she took on, especially almost all men there, and say, we have to keep it, even if it loses money. All the other things, the baking, the other jobs, everything else will collapse if we have to close that child care center. And I think she had so much love for those mothers and kids. You can't imagine.
There was an old woman on Mount Dai. A monastic asked her, where is the path to Mount Dai? And the old woman said, go right straight ahead. And the monastic went on. The woman said, my dear Reverend, you too go off like that. Monastics came one after another to ask that same question and received the same answer from the old woman. And later, one of the monastics told Zhao about it. Master Zhao said, wait here a minute. Now let me go check her out. He went to the woman and said, where is the path to Mount Dai? And the woman said, go right straight ahead. And Zhao went on. The woman said after him, my dear Reverend, you too go off like that. And Zhao came back to his monks and said, I've checked out that old woman. Go right straight ahead. And from Jishu's journal, all our paths are superintended. You have always been on the path. You can't fall off the path. Everything is conspiring to lead you home to experience your true nature. Everything you are doing now, including all the mess ups and screw ups and mistakes, are exactly the right thing for you to learn what you need to know to move along the path. All the causes and conditions of your unique life have brought you to this very moment. And given your particular set of causes and conditions, you have always done your best. So imagine with me, if you will, 40 some years ago, standing with me in the grand stone entryway of a 26-room Victorian mansion, perched high above the Hudson River, on an emerald green hill of grass and trees. We're waiting for a new Zen student who's due to appear any minute. She's on foot, walking from the bus, which has brought her from the city to the hillside. This hillside that's often called a place of old wealth and natural pristine beauty, a home of Grayston Seminary, now the Zen community of New York. You gaze into the leafy red and gold October maples arching across the driveway in the late afternoon, autumn sun. And suddenly a young woman with a Buster Brown haircut emerging from the shadows comes into the light. She wears green knee socks, brown Oxfords, a white blouse with a Peter Pan collar, a blue and green plaid skirt, a sweater tied around her waist, and she's carrying a beat-up old leather book bag over her shoulder. As Eve said, she looks like a high school girl at first. And as she comes closer, she's actually much older, in her 40s, a sad-eyed brunette beauty with lines of worry furrowing her brow. In the first image, it's not possible to know if it's the weight of the bag or the weight of her life that makes her hunch forward as she steps over the threshold into our life of practice. As we begin to live together as roommates and Dharma siblings, Jishu shared with me her deep psychic struggles and sensitivities, sometimes in words, but mostly in silent behaviors. I remember many late night conversations, tears in the dark, her frustration with what we called ancient twisted karma, the mysteries about which we eventually began to refer to with a wistful laugh as, oh, it's just our ATK. From the start, it was clear she was highly intelligent and deeply committed to spiritual practice and devoted to Bernie. What was also clear was that the physical and emotional strain of our life at Grayston took a heavy toll on her. Her fatigue frustrated her, drove her to work more and more hours, and resulted in a pattern of brief exuberance followed by depression and withdrawal from others. By 1983, she and I had received lay ordination and priest ordination together, both firmly embedded in the workings of the Zen community and Grayston Bakery. And in 1986, when we started our first social action ministry, Grayston Family Inn, she was named the director, as Eve has said. So the mission of Grayston Family Inn, which included building apartments for homeless families and mostly single mothers and children, was an enormous job. Yonkers at that time had the highest per capita rate of homelessness in the country. We had almost no money and no professionals in the field as part of our community. And they didn't welcome us there in Yonkers right away. So we were building everything from scratch: relationships, practice, a place to be. And for Jishu, our practice became more and more difficult. In many ways, she was a hermit, and she said about herself that she always wanted to be a nun and practice in simple seclusion. So there she was at the Zen community of New York, thrust into a communal setting, living in the midst of a large group of people. People around her morning, noon, and night, not just Zen practitioners. Other people like construction workers with immigration problems, the local ethnic community who called and frowned on the strange white Zen people living in their midst, but called anyway. And then the creditors, has been noted, who called day and night. But she also, as has been said, continued to be devoted, particularly to mothers and children, muddling through with them sometimes their backgrounds of poverty and drugs and alcohol. But because she was not by personality sociable or gregarious, usually rather shy and timid, she often worried about this as being a real failing, and she thought of herself as not likable. But by choice, she took it all on and she went right straight ahead. And in those early days when other students asked her, "What's going on with you? What's the matter?" she would stumble and flush and stutter and say, "I don't know. I really don't know. I just know I can't do it anymore." And then she might disappear for several weeks. This was in the very beginning. In Petra's talk, she quoted from Jishu's journal. "My father was a seeker all his life. He could never find peace. He could never see that he's everything that happens to him. His whole world seems to be a struggle against the enemy, both internal and external. And sometimes she too would struggle with the enemy, closing off from us weeks, one time over a month. There was great worry about her. We were all exhausted." As Eve said, yes, we were all exhausted in those early days. Many of us self-critical, doubting our endurance and even our faith at times. And mostly we tried to hide it. But being Jishu's roommate, I benefited from how she challenged herself at times. And I could see how, by not hiding her exhaustion, her disarrayed self, she was quite brave, not turning away, going right straight ahead. I knew she had plenty of pain, but I also knew she had plenty of faith. Faith in something greater. Faith in not turning away from the pain. She had a vow that she took seriously about saving and serving all beings. Since we'd taken our vows together and we'd studied the precepts, we'd written about them together and presented them in one-on-one exams with Maizumi and Bernie. That's what we did in those days. We had exams. We discussed our many fears, our hopes, and our dreams. And as two women priests living full-time in that community, both of us felt an enormous responsibility to be of service and to live a life of faith, to give our best effort to stabilizing what was even then a shaky Zen community. Trying with others to make the Grayston Bakery and Cafe sources of sustainable and ethical livelihood for our community. I remember one time when Maizumi Roshi called the day before he was to arrive, telling us that he was bringing 100 guests from Japan with him. And Jishu went to bed. She said, "I'm not having it." And when he got there, he said, "Where's Jishu?" And I didn't want to tell him. And he finally pressed me. She was very stressed and sleep deprived when he arrived in her room. And she looked so bad. And he had that beautiful smile, Roshi. He just smiled and sat down on the bed with her as she cried. And then he cried. And then he said, "You are beautiful even when you are tired." And she was beautiful even when she was tired. She got up that day. She came down and Roshi told her she wasn't allowed to do anything but sit and be served. It nearly killed her. She didn't like that at all. But then after a while, she sort of relaxed into it. But in fact, it was a long struggle. And literally at times the suffering made her sick and she would break down. But she'd say, "I fall apart when I can't take it anymore. I'm sorry. It's an awful truth, but it's true." And for many of us, especially for the other monks who were in those days what I called in a competition of who could be the most selfless self, she would bring us back to honesty. We all felt like we were falling apart. The honesty was just one of her beautiful qualities. She was a great disciple of truthfulness, so obvious in her facial and physical expressions, no artifice or pretension. It was really impossible for her to mask her feelings, glad or sad, sometimes frustrated. She was intense, an indefatigable practitioner, committed, passionate, often very humble, but also determined. From her journal, "I find that my own struggles are an integral part of my spiritual path, and that my awakening is very, very gradual. Only the wounded healer is able to heal. As long as we think spiritual leaders have to be perfect, we live in poverty. I have a perfect teacher inside. There is no perfect teacher outside." So I only saw her once again after I left. I saw her in 13 years later in 1998 when she called me full of excitement a few days before she and Bernie arrived in Santa Fe, where I had lived for a decade. And when I first saw her as she ran out to greet me, the fatigue around her eyes and the sallow color of her skin alarmed me. But we were so excited to see each other, chirping away like little birds as we made tea. And then we hung pictures together on the adobe walls of their new home and talked late into the night. We were together nonstop for 2 days and most of 2 nights, hardly covered either the new or old territory of our lives. We had so much we wanted to share. "Maybe you'll join Zen Peacemakers," she smiled and winked at me as I left that second night, saying, "We could practice together again. I'm so much more fun now," she said. Our 2 days together had been a gift, restorative and intimate, magical for both of us. And I felt a vibrant healing energy in her presence. And the next day, when she suffered the near fatal heart attack, it was unbearable. But then she started to recover. But then a second heart attack. And when she died, I knew from talking with Peter that there was a whole world deep in shock out there. The finality, the grief and the mystery of all the ancient twisted karma. Her journey as a wounded healer, and the gifts of her practice still being felt here, right here today, going right straight ahead. You can't fall off the path.